Don't you dare speak to him that way.
The station at Silver Butte held its breath like a man bracing for bad news. Sunlight pooled on the warped planks, and heat shimmered above the rails as if the desert itself were trying to erase what had just occurred. Eleanor Hart Nora, if anyone bothered to ask, stood with her trunk and the letter that unstitched her future in 3 uncharitable sentences. Too plain, too opinionated, and this last cruelty, unsuitable for the expectations of a gentleman investor. The ink had dried, but the humiliation was still wet. The station master had mumbled something about the eastbound freight in the morning and retreated behind his grill, the clack of the telegraph as brisk and indifferent as the rest of the territory. Nora pressed the letter against her bodice, feeling the tremor in her own hands, the kind she used to hide from her students back in Street Louis. She'd traveled 1,000 miles to be measured by a stranger's eyes and found wanting. The wind lifted her bonnet ribbon and let it fall again, a small mockery of comfort in a place that had none to give. She did not cry. Tears belonged to softer climates, to parlors with curtains and to mothers who said things like, "Hush now, darling," and believed it would help. Here, the sky was a lid of white iron. The land answered only to persistence. After perhaps a minute, perhaps an hour, a shadow detached itself from the glare and crossed the platform with unhurried tread. He was tall, sun-browned, the kind of brown that doesn't fade when the hat comes off. His coat was a working man's canvas, his vest too honest to hide a thing. Spurs sang once, then went quiet. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough at the edges, "you waiting on someone or on sense to return?" She met his eyes because she had nothing left to trade but pride. "Mr. Oliver Finch," she said, saying the name scraped her throat. He changed his mind on sight. "I suppose that makes me a cautionary tale for other women with decisiveness and the wrong nose." The corner of the man's mouth obeyed a thought and almost smiled. "Name's Jesse Calder, Half Moon Sea, north of the Cottonwoods." He tipped his hat, not to charm but to clear the sun from his view. "I came in for salt and seed. Ran into Mr. Finch an hour ago at Pike's office. He looked like a man proud of not keeping his word." "If there is a pride for that, Mr. Finch must be its grand marshal," Nora said. It came out more bitter than clever. She glanced at her trunk, then back to the track gleaming toward nowhere she wanted. "I've $12 and a train in the morning. The arithmetic is not in my favor." "Arithmetic changes with shelter," Jesse said. He glanced toward the telegraph window, then back. "Station master here is a good man, but he can't hold back talk. Silver Butte will do what small towns do. Some of it you can ignore. Some of it will leave a mark." He paused. "I can take you to the boarding house, or if you'll forgive my forwardness, I can offer you a room at my place. Work for wages. People can call you what they please. I'll call you Miss Hart, unless you prefer otherwise." At 200 miles from home, the word forwardness meant safety more than sin. Nora felt the heat rise to her face anyway. "Mr. Calder, I don't require rescue, only dignity." "Rescues for floods," he said. "Dignity's earned between chores." His gaze did not appraise her, it measured the problem. "I'll tell folks you're my wife if it'll spare you ugliness. Inside my gate, you're my housekeeper, and free to leave when you like. That's the long and short. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming." Silence went on ticking. Somewhere down the line a hawk lifted and stitched a lazy figure 8 against the white. The station master's chair creaked. Nora realized the thing banging around in her chest was not panic but possibility, rude and uninvited. "What is Half Moon Sea?" she asked, because surrendering your life to a noun you hadn't heard of 5 minutes ago was how tragedies were made. "2 sections spread under the ridge," he said. "Windmill that behaves when it's bribed. A house that was a bachelor's declaration until it ran out of pride. A cowhand who knows more about water than all the bankers in town, and 23 head that are better at pretending to be 30. It's honest work. No one there will make you smaller to fill their own hats." The platform tilted, then steadied. Nora folded the letter in half, then in half again, then tucked it into her reticule like a receipt from a foolish purchase. "If we are to lie, Mr. Calder, Let it be a lie that keeps knives out of my back, not one that puts a ring on my finger. I accept employment, not ownership." "Good," he said simply. "I've no talent for owning people." He lifted her trunk as if insulted by its weight, and nodded toward the yard where a wagon waited between two bays the color of toasted bread. "Tomas keeps the team sound," he added, almost to himself, as if saying the name made the world steadier. They rode through Silver Butte, while the town arranged its curiosity into human shapes. Men in shirt sleeves paused with the habit of measuring another man's horse before they measured his company. Women stopped in doorways like commas that meant different things depending on the reader. A boy pointed. His mother lowered his hand. Jesse lifted 2 fingers from the reins to the sheriff, who lifted 2 back. Nothing dramatic happened, which, in a town like this, was a kind of miracle. "Pike's Bank," Jesse said as they jolted past a brick building with windows too clean for the territory. "If a man wants to sell his tomorrow, Pike will count it for him and charge interest on the counting." "Was Mr. Finch selling his?" Nora asked, even though she knew. "Men like Finch sell other people's," Jesse said. "Costs less somehow." A windmill winked on the horizon. Cottonwoods gathered along a slender vein of water, their leaves silvering when the breeze remembered to breathe. Jesse turned the team off the main road onto a rutted track that did not apologize for being itself. As they crested a knoll, Half Moon Sea unrolled like a modest truth, a plank porch, a barn with a shoulder to it, pens healed more than built, and beyond them, land that would forgive you if you worked at deserving it. A man with iron-gray hair and sun-creased eyes lifted a hand from the corral gate. "Señor," he called, "bendita agua clouds by the ridge." Then his gaze found Nora, and his face shifted to welcome. "Buenas tardes, señorita. Soy Tomas Vega. Mi casa es su casa," when the boss remembers to say it. Jesse took off his hat, as if the joke had brushed dust from his manners. "Miss Hart, Tomas. Miss Hart's taking the back room and the kitchen's mine." To Nora. "Room's yours. No expectations but ordinary kindness." Inside, the air was cooler in the way. Shade is cooler by degree and by mercy. The main room was clean, with the earnestness of a man who'd taught himself to be tidy after losing what he loved. A bookshelf leaned under the weight of a few dog-eared novels and a cavalry manual, whose spine had given up first. "The pump's out back," Jesse said. "We eat when the work agrees. If anyone in town asks, you came on the noon stage and married me for my bad coffee." He was not smiling when he said it, which made it kinder. Nora stood in the doorway of the small room that would be hers. A narrow bed, a chest, a window that squared a piece of sky like a photograph you hadn't yet learned to adore. Her throat closed with something that might one day become gratitude if not addressed too directly. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Jesse," he corrected, and the name was a bridge offered without toll. "Jesse," she tried quietly. "I will not owe you beyond wages and respect." "You'll owe me the same," he said. "It's a good way to keep the ledger clean." He shifted, suddenly awkward, a large man made careful by a small room. "I'll be down by the south fence if you need me. Tomas'll show you the stove's tricks. It has 3, and 2 of them aren't in your favor." When they left, Nora touched the sill with her fingertips. The way you touch a thing you're not sure is meant for you. Outside, the windmill turned, and the desert's long patience settled around Half Moon Sea like a vow no one had yet spoken aloud. That night, while Tomas whistled through the washing up and Jesse sat on the porch with his hat low and his thoughts lower, Nora opened her trunk and made the room look a little like a person lived there. Books in a square stack, a comb on the dresser, her mother's brooch catching the last coin of sunset and sending it back. She did not sleep easily, but when she woke at the first shout of a rooster who had more faith than proof, she found something simple and fierce had rooted in her. "I will not be undone by a man's smallness." The desert could take many things. It would not take that. Half Moon Sea taught its lessons in the language of small tasks repeated until they resembled prayer. Mornings began in the blue hour, when the world wasn't yet sure it wanted to exist. Coffee tasted like a decision, bread dough coaxed from flour that had seen better trains. Tomas showed Nora the garden more intention than fact and the trench that would be a canal if hope were water. "Here the shade makes deals the sun cannot veto," he said, setting a hoe in her hands as if it were a pen, and the earth a stubborn paper. Nora's first batch of cornbread came out with a personality burnt around the truth and soft in the center. Jessie ate it without making her feel like gravity had failed. "Stove favors its left side," he said, as if warning her about a mule's hind leg, and smiled in a way that warmed the kitchen by 2 degrees. She learned the names of the chores and the names of things that pretended not to be chores. Oiling the pump, stacking the split pinion in a crosshatch that wouldn't slide, scrubbing the table smooth enough to reflect a sky when there wasn't one. In town, rumor braided itself quickly. At the ranch, time unbraided it again. Days stopped being counted and started being carried. On the 3rd morning, Jessie found a calf shivering in the corral, a late-born, narrow-headed little apology of an animal. "Breech birth," Tomas said, feeling along its ribs. "La Madre's spent. He'll need a thief for a mother." "I can be stolen from," Nora said before she'd considered what that meant. She wrapped the calf in a blanket and fed him milk from a bottle that creaked under her grip. The calf blinked with sleepy astonishment, then accepted the world as if it had always been thus. "We can't keep all our softness," Jessie said quietly from the gate. "Out here, it'll collect interest." "Then I will lend it only to the deserving," Nora answered, looking the little creature in the eye as though they were signing papers. She named him Mercer for no reason that made sense, and each feeding stitched her to the ranch in a thread no one saw. Silver Butte's Sundays were for supplies and sins. When Nora and Jessie drove in for flour, the town said good morning with its chin. Mrs. Hammond at the dry goods looked at their ribbons, not their faces. Sheriff Banks tipped his hat to Jessie, then tipped it to Nora, as if to say the law knows how to spell decency, even when it's not on the signboard. Edwin Pike watched from his window, a ledger open in front of him like a priest's book, and Nora felt the chill that follows a man who can make draughts with paper. "Mr. Calder," Pike called when they passed. "You're a prudent man. I'd be prudent now. There's talk of reallocating creek access east of your fence. Sell your rights before the new survey leaves you with memory instead of water." "Reallocation isn't a word the creek knows," Jessie said, reins loose in his hands. "It runs where the ground tells it, not where men with pens get lonely." Pike's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Men with pens make maps. Maps make claims. Claims make sheriffs come calling." "Sheriffs already know the way to my gate," Jessie said. "They come for coffee." Low. Back at the ranch, the sky broke into a brief, generous weeping that left the dust pocked and the men dumbly grateful. Nora stood under the eaves, palms up, and laughed so softly it startled her. Jessie saw it and looked away, because some happinesses belong to the person who found them. That evening, a letter arrived by the hand of a boy who rode too tall for his horse. Tomas accepted it at the gate and brought it to the porch where Jessie was mending a bridle. "For Miss Hart," he said, and the name felt real enough to touch. Nora read standing up, because bad news doesn't deserve a chair. It was from Street Lewis, and carried the polite impatience of people who balance sums with relatives' names. Her aunt wrote that Nora's father's debts had hardened into something a girl could not charm away, and there was talk of selling the house. The room swayed. Jessie rose instinctively, then stopped himself 2 paces early. "My father played the violin," Nora said to no one in particular. "He tuned other people's instruments for money, and our hopes for free." She folded the letter in exacting halves and laid it beside the lamp. "I need more work," she said, "or fewer memories." "We could take in sewing from town," Jessie offered. "And Tomas can teach you the ditch lines. If we get the siphon to pull from the bend where cottonwoods shade, the melons might believe in us." "I will believe first," Nora said, almost fiercely. Tomas inclined his head, as if she'd given the right answer to a question only he had heard. The next weeks stretched like a wire between fence posts, sharp, necessary, singing in the wind. Nora learned to sit a horse with the efficient grace of a woman who respected the ground because she had made its acquaintance too often. She learned the difference between a sky that lied and a sky that promised. She learned Jessie's silences, the one for thinking, the one for grieving, the one for asking without asking. When he spoke of his time as a scout, the words came measured, like water rationed across distance. There had been a night, a village, a decision made by men who would sleep later and dream fine dreams. Jesse had carried the order had carried sorrow. He did not ask to be forgiven. He asked only to spend what was left of himself on something truer. Mercer butted at her knee, healthy now and arrogant about it. "You're a good thief," Jesse said, watching her scratch the calf's poll. "No," Nora answered, smiling despite herself. "I am a lender with fair terms." Tomas laughed and went back to sharpening the scythe. The windmill turned, complaining, then complied. The ditch crept forward under their shovels, a stubborn artery that would not give up on the idea of green. Some evenings, Jesse set the cavalry manual aside and read a page of Middlemarch, as if wrestling with a slow beast. When he stumbled, Nora fed him the word. They did not touch. They learned one another's edges through the work, which is the safest way. The ranch had a music. It played only for those who stayed past noon. Midday, the cicadas took up their rattles like distant maracas, and the heat put its palm on your head to bless you or warn you, it was never clear which. In that hour the house itself seemed to breathe, timbers ticking, tin roof pinging, the kettle's little sigh as it thought about boiling, and decided to wait. Nora mended by the window then. Every stitch an argument against come apart. She discovered she could make a shirt last longer than a season if she patched where pride didn't show. The gusset, the inside elbow, that sly place where a belt rubs. Jesse never said thank you for those quiet salvations. He wore them into the day like proof a man could be held together by care he had not earned. In the afternoons, Tomas taught her the ditch lines, how a shovel's bite changed with soil and mood, how water would agree to come only if you introduced it to gravity with courtesy. "It's the angle," he said, squatting to show her, calloused finger cutting a shallow rune in the dust. "Too steep, the water runs loco, wasteful like a drunk. Too flat, it sulks. You give it the humble slope this much so it feels clever, like it decided." "Like a man," she said dryly. He chuckled. "See, like a good one." On a day that tasted like iron, a dust devil came across the pasture with the arrogance of a preacher after payday. The world went the color of old books. Grit got into Nora's teeth and said there, "Now we are family." She ran for the wash strung between porch posts, gathering Jesse's shirts to her chest, and the cloth beat at her like captured flags. Jesse appeared through the brown, hand on the porch beam, eyes narrowed to slits. He took the bundle from her and shouldered open the door. Inside they leaned against opposite walls, breath loud, hair full of small geology. A laugh started somewhere on Nora's person, rusted at first, then loosened by its own courage. "What?" Jesse asked, genuinely bewildered. "Is funny in this?" "I never thought about dust the whole way out here," she said. "People warn you about rattlesnakes and men with cheap hats. No one mentions dust having elbows." He grinned brief, unguarded as the house shuddered, and the storm shouldered past on to scold someone else's fence. After the wind, the light returned as if ashamed of leaving. Nora went back out with the basket. The wash had been knocked loose and lay under the cottonwood like a surrendered army. She knelt and lifted each piece, shaking Grit, talking under her breath to the cloth as if it could listen. "We're all trying, aren't we?" When she rose, Jesse was there with the line and a new length of twine. He tied the square knots without boasting and stood a moment while the shirts took the breeze, each one briefly, a man who'd turned to wave. That evening a rider came up the lane with the nervous gait of somebody carrying a story too big for his horse. A surveyor, sharp-collared, narrow-shoed, sat the saddle like a man sits a piano bench. "Afternoon," he called, dismounting, eyes already measuring. "Name's Lyle Carter, County Survey. Got instructions to confirm water allocations up this way. Shouldn't take but a moment." "Water doesn't take moments," Jesse said mildly, coming down off the porch, palms loose. "It takes patience and the right to exist." Carter produced a map. Lines that had been born in an office, tried to look authoritative in the sun and failed. "Just the elevations, Mr. Calder. And the old C marker down by your cottonwoods. I'll need eyes on it." Tomas was already walking. "I show you," he said, but his tone wrote a margin note Carter couldn't read. They led him to the cottonwoods, Nora matching their stride, Mercer gambling on the other side of the fence like a child forbidden from the important talk. The old survey stake weather gray, leaning still, claimed a corner of the world like an old soldier leaning on his rifle. Carter squinted at it as though it had been made to personally inconvenience him. "See," he said finally, tapping the map. "This here suggests the creek's natural bank lies 6 rods to the east." "Oh, it suggests wrong," Jesse said. "Natural banks don't move to please ink." Carter's smile had the fragility of a porcelain cup. "Well, maps are how the county agrees with itself. I'll note your concern, Mr. Calder." "You note the cottonwoods," Tomas said, palm on the bark. "They drink where their fathers drank. That is the map." Carter made his annotations and rode away, wanting to be somewhere else. Nora watched him until he was a hinge in the distance, and then a dot. She felt the old ache, how little one woman's breath could push back an office. She leaned her forehead to the cottonwood's cool skin and closed her eyes. The tree made no vow, but the breeze in its leaves said, "We endure," in a language you felt more than heard. Nights lengthened, then shortened, as if the earth couldn't decide where to rest. Nora tended Mercer by lamplight, the calf's warm head heavy against her thigh, milk breath sweet and ridiculous in the dark. She wrote 2 letters, one to her aunt, with money folded thin as an apology, one to the school in Street Lewis, whose letterhead had been used against her. "I still teach," she wrote, "only now the students are stubborn. Water, earth, myself, they are learning." She sealed both with wax and the small fire of having something worth sending. Sometimes, after the dishes, Jesse strung rawhide along the porch rail and showed her the slow art of braiding reins. "You don't force leather," he said. "You convince it. There's a difference." His voice held a knowledge about convincing and being convinced. She braided beside him, tongue between teeth, eyes narrowed at the task. When she finished, her braid had a wobble a mother would forgive. He examined it with grave ceremony. "It will not break," he said. "It will merely remember where it came from." Coyotes came close on a copper night and set to singing with too much confidence. Mercer bawled high in the barn. The older cows answered with derision. Jesse stepped off the porch with his rifle, the same way a man goes to his front gate when he hears a stranger knock, firm, not eager. Nora followed to the edge of the lamplight and stood there, hands on the railing, listening to how thin the night made a person if she let it. The coyotes settled a dispute among themselves and moved along. Jesse didn't fire. He came back and leaned his rifle in its corner, then stood beside her without commentary. She realized that was his favorite way to speak, standing where she stood until the silence agreed to divide its weight. On a Tuesday that smelled faintly of creosote and regret, Mrs. Hammond sent a boy with a bundle, a stack of mending and 3 dress orders from women whose husbands swore they preferred work to finery and then begged for both. Nora laid the work out on the table and touched each garment as if listening for where it had failed. The mending money would not save the house in Street Louis, but it would keep her from feeling like a person living on the wrong side of her own ledger. She sewed while the men set fence, the clock ticking in the next room like a heart it refused to share. Among the mending, she found a child's pinafore with a tear along the seam where a small life had evidently attempted flight. She mended that one first, imagining the mother's relief at one small thing behaving itself. When she held it up to the window's light, the stitch line gleamed briefly, straight and true. She thought of the violin again, how fine strings learned humility under calloused fingers. Jesse, coming in for water, paused and watched her hold the pinafore like proof that the world could still be made gentle in places. "Looks like it will survive a second childhood," he said. "May it be sweeter than the first," she answered. He drank, set down the dipper, and lingered. "Banks stopped by in town," he said. "Said Pike's committee hopes to meet next month. Said they'll need testimony. Said I could save everyone trouble by conceding the bend." "Concede," she repeated, tasting the ugliness of ease. "Is there money in being wrong?" "There's always money in being quick," he said. "Less in being right." "Oh." She looked at the dipper, at the water that reflected her face in a wobbly way that felt accurate. "Then go slow, Mr. Calder." He almost smiled. "As if I know any other speed." A rattlesnake announced itself one afternoon with the honesty only danger carries. Tomas froze first, hand up, palm a prayer. The snake had coiled under the porch step where Cool lived. Mercer, too curious for his own continued existence, nosed toward the sound. Jesse's hand already had the shovel. His eyes had the math of angles. He moved without theater, quick, direct, as if taking a pain from an animal before it knew to panic. The shovel fell, precise. After, he buried the head deep, because some things must not return. Nora leaned against the post, the world a little more in focus for having brushed its own edge. Jesse, seeing her pallor, said nothing tender. He offered the canteen. She drank, and the water put her back in herself. At supper, the talk was simple and slow, like stew that had needed hours. Tomas told a story about a saint who had fed many with little, and then swept his own floor afterward because saints don't hire that part out. Jesse ate with the steady appreciation of a man who has known worse. Nora listened to the sounds of a house that was learning her, its small approvals in creaks and soft shifts. And always Mercer. The calf gained mischief, as if it were weight. He learned which latch looked weakest and how to push his head like a clever thought through the slat. When he wandered into the yard during a sewing spell, Nora shooed him with the firm affection a patient teacher reserves for the student who wants attention instead of learning. "You are a borrower," she told him. "You will repay in steaks and gratitude." The notion amused Tomas so deeply, he nearly lost a finger to his laughter and the scythe. There were evenings when Jesse brought the tin of coffee to the porch, and they sat with cups that steamed like small trains. He spoke of Missouri and winter rivers that turned stiff as bad manners, a blacksmith father who shaped iron and boys, sometimes with the same hammer. He liked truth in straight lines, Jesse said, but life writes cursive. Nora told him about the schoolgirls, their velvet ribbons hiding bruised tempers, and their quick minds trapped in cages named acceptable. She confessed to the petty thrill of teaching a rule so well she could show them how to break it gracefully. "Rebellion with grammar," he said. "I approve. Rebellion with grace," she corrected. "Grammar is just the carriage. Meaning is the horse." When the moon came up thin as a sickle, she thought of harvests that failed and still counted as effort. When it rose fat and full, she let its silver spill on the floorboards and did not sweep it away. Some nights she cried without ceremony, the kind of quiet weeping that respects sleeping houses. If Jesse heard, he let the walls do their work, adding a stick of wood to the fire as if warmth could be a reply. One night, star-blown brittle, she woke to the smell of smoke and was already moving when the thought arrived. The barn? No. The kitchen. The coffee had flirted too long with fire and gone to sulk. She lifted the kettle and cussed with a thoroughness that made Tomas proud the next day when she recounted it. By lamplight she poured out the ruin and scrubbed the pot to shining, as if scrubbing could erase other scorchings. She stood a long while with her hands in the cooling water and let the ache move through her like a procession. It exited through her fingertips and into the basin. She dried the pot. Dawn considered entering the room. She let it. Jesse found her there and didn't pretend he didn't see. He set a fresh scoop in the tin, as if laying down a small promise. "Try again," he said simply. They did. The coffee tasted like a decision that had survived the night. The ditch, day by patient day, learned obedience. At the subtle turn Tomas called the stubborn elbow, water finally consented to curve without tantrum. They stood ankle-deep, all three, soaked and grinning, and Nora laughed with a free edge that startled birds from the cottonwoods. The sound carried down the furrow and came back as a softer thing, as if the land had agreed to repeat it in a language of its own. They planted melon seed in mounds like little faiths. Jesse pressed each with his palm the way a man confirms a gate is latched. "We may be fools," he said. "Better fools for water than geniuses for thirst," Nora replied. The first sprout showed when nobody was watching. Tomas spotted it, knelt, and tipped his hat. "Señorita," he said to the green, "bienvenida." Nora knelt too and touched the leaf with a fingertip barely there. She felt how the living wants to live, how a little shade can be a treaty, how the ditch sang in a voice you could nearly hum. On a market morning they went to town with a bolt of calico transformed under Nora's needle into a dress someone would wear to remember she was pretty, Mrs. Hammond weighed it with a careful eye and put coins in Nora's palm that clinked like praise. The sound filled a pocket in her that had been empty too long. Across the street, Pike pretended not to notice. Sheriff Banks did notice and said, "Good work travels, so does foolishness." He tipped his hat. "I aim to travel with the first." They drove home slow, letting the mules have their say. On the ridge, the world spilled out like an apology for all the days it had been small. Nora squinted against the light and felt something in her chest unclench some old fist finally tired. She looked at Jesse and saw the peace a man gets when he has decided to be decent even if it isn't profitable. She thought of all the women back in Street Lewis and how they taught themselves to breathe shallow to fit. She breathed deep to offend that memory and to honor what her lungs were for. Later, a cloud bank rose like a city in the west. Thunder tried on its voice. Lightning licked the far mesa with lazy affection. The air smelled like a promise with teeth. Jesse checked the roof. Tomas tied what needed tying. Nora gathered the wash and left one shirt on the line just to see if the storm would take it. It didn't. It kissed it with rain and left it cleaner than before, which is a kind of miracle nobody preaches about. When the rain came, it came right. The ditch brimmed without bragging. The windmill turned and did not complain. Mercer stood in the doorway of the barn with an expression that plainly said he had invented water. Nora stepped into the rain again, unpinned hair heavy on her shoulders, palms up and eyes closed, letting the desert's rare mercy right on her skin. Jesse watched from the porch, not because he owned the site, but because he'd been invited. After, in the cool that follows honesty, they ate by lamplight. Tomas told the rain thank you, in 3 languages and 1 whistle. Jesse buttered the cornbread from a pan that finally obeyed, and Nora accepted a slice as if accepting a small apology from the day. They said little. Quiet had grown trustworthy between them. When they rose, Jesse took her plate like a reflex he had practiced into instinct. She let him. That, too, was a treaty. Night carried them gently to the threshold of sleep and set them down. Somewhere far off a train announced itself to people who would not hear it for hours. The frogs found their argument and stuck to it. Nora lay under the small window she had cleaned until the stars could see in. She thought of all she had not chosen that had chosen her anyway, and of this, which she had, and would again. The next morning, in a light as clean as truth after confession, the melon sprouts were 2. Mercer nibbled a leaf and learned discipline. Tomas fixed the fence with commentary. Jesse went to the shop to bring back a coil of pipe heavier than a man wants to lift alone. Nora tied back her hair and set her needle to the day's work. The world did not praise them. It permitted them. Sometimes that is better. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love stories of the last West town. The truth came out the way true things do sideways, after dark, when the lamps were low and Pride had wandered off to drink alone. It was windless, the kind of night that lets a person hear themselves too clearly. Nora had mended shirts until the pile gave up, then sat on the porch step with a cup cooling in her hands. Jesse was near the rail, shoulder to the post, watching the absence of weather, as if it might change its mind. "In street, Louis," she said, not looking at him, "I taught girls to parse sentences that would not save them. The assistant headmaster liked to visit my classroom unannounced. He had opinions about the future kept in places that weren't his business. When I told him no, he wrote me a future of his own. My references bent to his handwriting. The school chose his reputation over my reality. I left with neither." She waited for the sound men make when they are choosing sides. It didn't come. Jesse set his cup on the rail, a quiet punctuation. "In the Dakotas," he said after a time, "we were told a village held fighters. The map said so, and the man with the map had an office with a door that closed. We rode in before dawn because decency is a daylight habit. I found a woman with a child under a bed that wasn't high enough to hide hope. Orders shrink a man until his name no longer fits him." He rubbed his jaw, maybe remembering a beard he'd shaved off to meet himself again. "I left my piece of that night in the dirt. I have been living in installments since." Nora exhaled. "The night took it and did not return change. We are a fine pair," she said almost lightly. "A slandered woman and a man paying down a debt to himself." "Better that than a liar and a man who doesn't know he owes," Jesse said. He was not absolving himself, nor asking her to do it. He was making room for something that did not hiss when the wind came through. They were quiet long enough for a moth to audition for the lamp and fail its courage. Out in the dark, a cow shifted the way a big creature shifts when it remembers being small. When Nora spoke again, her voice carried fewer splinters. "I kept 2 letters," she said. "One from the headmaster, written in the tidy cruelty of a man who confuses order with moral authority. The second from a girl I taught Lydia with ink blots like hailstones. She wrote that I made grammar feel like a ladder someone could climb out of a well. The first letter shut doors. The second kept my hand from becoming a fist." Jessie nodded without looking at her. "Sometimes a life is just a ledger, where we refuse to carry the wrong totals forward." "Do you keep anything from that night?" she asked. "Waking," he said simply, "and a promise I keep badly to do no harm where I can help it, and if I can't help it, to do no harm where I can walk away. It turns out both are harder than the men in the office suppose." She turned the cup in her hands. The china was crazed with fine cracks, the kind that hold clean water anyway. "Would you ever take it back," she asked, "if you could go to that office and draw a different map?" Jessie's answer took time because it needed to. "I can't give that woman and her child their morning back," he said at last. "I can only refuse to be the kind of man who pretends a different morning arrived. Some of us live now by scrubbing the day we are in." Nora breathed out and let night have the rest. In town the next day, Mrs. Hammond measured Nora from shoulder to hem with a tape that clicked like a cricket. "You're settling nicely," she said, and meant the clothes rather than the soul. Sheriff Banks asked after the half-moon and its water. "Pike didn't ask," he announced. "Survey forms are filed," he told Jessie, "and the committee meets next week. I'd be practical if I were you." "Oh, if you were me," Jessie said, "you'd be a different man, and we wouldn't be having this talk." They bought seed anyway, because hope is scandalous that way. On the way out, a stranger tipped his hat to Nora with a smirk that wanted witnesses. "Mail-order bride that didn't take," he said softly, loud enough. "Calder doesn't mind tarnish on a pretty spoon, looks like." Nora turned before Jessie could. She met the man's eyes until he had to decide whether to double down or become smaller for free. "Sir," she said, calm as a well, "it is not my custom to be ashamed for the comfort of men I will never respect." Jessie waited. If she had needed him then, he would have been a wall. She did not, and he was something better present. Still, they passed the post office on the way to the wagon. A chalk notice on the wall announced, "Water Allocation Committee Public Comment, Tuesday." Underneath, in a slanted hand that could only belong to a clerk paid by the mile of ink, someone had added, "Owners must present deeds." Jessie looked at the words as though they were coyotes that might or might not cross the yard. "Bring your deeds," Nora said, as if it were that simple. "Land like mine remembers hands better than paper," Jessie answered. "But clerks enjoy paper's company." Back at the ranch, they set posts along the ditch line until their hands knew more about the earth than their mouths knew about talking. Tomas told a story about a grape arbor his mother had taught to climb the bones of a broken gate until it believed itself a trellis. "Cosas rotas pueden enseñar belleza," he said. "Broken things can teach beauty. Pero primero, trabajo." But first, work. Work they did. When Mercer pushed his head between the slats to complain about the timing of supper, Nora laughed in a way that knocked dust off the day. Jessie heard it and looked away again, because some sounds are for staying alive, not for making promises. That evening, she found a scrap of ribbon and tied back the curtain she'd hung herself. The sky obligingly presented a streak of indigo to match. She wrote her aunt, "I have wages, work, and a roof. Tell the collector a stubborn niece stands between him and grandfather's violin. If he must break something, let it be his habit, not the instrument." She sealed the envelope with more resolve than wax. Later, on the porch, Jessie lifted a small box from beneath the chair. "Tomas was in Tascosa last month," he said, awkward as a boy delivering bad poetry. "He brought back this because the stove's left side has enemies." Inside lay a new iron skillet, balanced, honest, and a tin of coffee that smelled like starting over. She traced the skillet's lip. "You buy a woman a sword, sir." "I buy tools," he said. "You're the one who turns them into swords." They did not speak of marriage. They spoke of the second bend in the creek, of placing stones, so the current remembered generosity. They spoke of seed and the shape of the wind. The truth they had told sat between them like a dog that had stopped barking and started sleeping in the doorway, a guardian now that it knew their names. The days that followed seemed stitched from the same cloth, and yet each had its own pattern when you held it to the light. Nora took in sewing from 3 houses, and a piano teacher who paid in quarters and desperate conversation. The teacher, Mrs. Boyd, was thin the way worry makes a person thin. She brought a jacket with a seam that kept resigning its post. While Nora pinned and listened, Mrs. Boyd confessed that her husband had a gentle hand for music and a hard one for money. "Do you ever feel," she asked, "as if your life is a song someone else keeps insisting on singing wrong?" "All the time," Nora said, and pricked her finger on the pin for emphasis. A bead of blood flowered. She put it to her tongue and tasted iron and improvement. "Change the key," she said. "If he does not follow, that tells you the rest." When Mrs. Boyd left, she overpaid, and Nora tried not to let gratitude look like relief. Tomas, seeing the small packet of coins, tipped his hat to it as if it were a guest. "Every peso comes with a story," he said. "We don't spend the story, but we should know it." He told them, then, one of his own, how a foreman once paid him late and in liquor because he had mistaken Tomas for the kind of man who would forget his dignity if you handed him a bottle. "I poured it out for the ants," Tomas said, eyes bright. They marched very straight for an hour, and then slept. Jesse laughed the laugh of a man who needed it. Nora put another stitch in the day and tied it off. A week before the committee meeting, a notice arrived by post addressed to Mr. Jesse Calder, Half Moon Sea. The envelope carried Pike's tidy authority. The letter invited Jesse to participate in a cooperative reassessment of water rights, which is how men sometimes spell taking. Jesse set the paper on the table and smoothed it with his hand. "Cooperative," he said, tasting the word as if it were a medicine that had lied about its flavor. Nora fetched the deeds from the small locked box under the bed. The pages were thin, as excuses and as old as somebody's father. "You'll go," she said, not as an order but as gravity. "I'll go," he agreed, "and I'll dress decent enough that Pike's pen blunts itself on my collar." Tomas rolled a cigarette he would not light. "I go with you," he said, "not because they hear my voice, because I hear what they don't say." They practiced restraint the way some men practice quick draw again and again, until the body remembers even when the mind is tired. On the morning of the meeting, Nora brushed the dust from Jesse's jacket and pressed her palm to his shoulder, as if the fabric could learn something from his steadiness. He looked at her hand as a man looks at rain that arrives on the day he needed it but didn't want to ask. "Say little," she said. "When you must, say it like you're building fence." "I always do," he said. "It's other people's words that come unstrung." At the town hall, a room that smelled of pine cleaner and declarations, a dozen men and one woman arranged themselves on chairs that had suffered through civic duty before. Pike stood, all business, with a map spread where a gospel might be. Sheriff Banks had taken a seat against the wall, one boot hooked over his knee, expression a mix of boredom and readiness. "Proceedings will be simple," Pike began, which meant they would be neither. "We aim for fairness. The creek has shifted. Claims must reflect today's reality." Jesse stood when addressed, doffing his hat just enough for manners without surrender. "The creek shifts, yes," he said. "So does a man's conscience. Some shifts improve the course, some do not." Pike gestured at the map. "According to county survey, according to the cottonwoods," Tomas interrupted, soft and mortally polite, "the water's father still sleeps in the same bed." A ripple moved through the chairs like a cat. Pike's eyebrows twitched. "I believe the county recognizes surveys, not trees." Banks spoke without lifting his head. "The county recognizes fights, it doesn't need to." Pike ignored that. "Mr. Calder," he said, "if the committee finds the bend to be east of your current ditch, you'll fill it. You'll accept a pipeline from farther upstream at your expense. That's progress. That's the law." Jesse studied the map as if it might confess something if you looked long enough. "The law is the shape of a town's memory," he said. Half Moon Sea has watered stock from that bend since before your bank had a door to lock. I will not starve my pasture to teach your surveyor to read a horizon." A man in a suit Jesse didn't recognize coughed money. "I represent Hargrove Holdings," he said. "We've purchased several parcels along the East Bank. The county must anticipate growth." "Growth," Sheriff Banks said, finally looking up, "isn't a synonym for greed, Mr. Lawyer. They start with the same letter, is all." Pike gave the sheriff a cauterized smile. "Order, please." Nora watched from the back, standing because the last chair had chosen an older woman's bones over hers. She felt the room split into two kinds of men, the ones who believed water should go to those who could draw straight lines, and the ones who believed it should go where life had proven it belonged. She also felt the third kind, the tired ones, who would go home after and tell their wives that meetings are smoke without fire, and why did supper taste distracted. When the men had said as much as men can say without repeating themselves, Pike called for comments. Nora did not plan to speak. Words were the trade that had betrayed her before, but something rose in her like a small dawn anyway. "May I?" she asked. "Don't," said the part of Jesse's eyes that knew rooms like this. "Do," said Tomas's slight tilt of the chin. She stepped to the map. "I don't own a deed here," she began. "I don't have a vote you count, but I have hands that have carried water and seed that has convinced itself to live. And I think those qualify me for this much, to remind you that rivers have memories better than ours. If you move the line, life moves with it and not always where your paper hopes." The lawyer smiled as if she were charming and small. "Ma'am, no one's stealing the water. We're reorganizing." Nora met him with the cool she had earned. "You can reorganize a cupboard and still not find the cup you want," she said. "But if you reorganize a man's well, you find his anger." Pike rapped the table. "The committee thanks you, Mrs. Miss Hart," she said, because the truth of that arrangement was still their own. "And I'll thank you not to say thanks like a dismissal." Banks coughed something that might have been a laugh. "Noted," he said. "In the end, committees do what they came to do. They tabled the decision, which is a way of letting trouble breed." Pike announced a site observation for the following week, as if water needed to be seen to be believed. Jesse tipped his hat to the room in a manner that acknowledged decorum without admitting defeat. On the steps outside, he waited for Nora to join him. The afternoon had gone sullen. A dust devil flirted with the livery and then thought better of it. "Thank you," he said, almost grudgingly, as if she had saved him from something he would never name. "I didn't change anything," she said. "You changed how I heard them," he said. "That's more dangerous." They rode home with the sound of hooves doing the arithmetic. Halfway to the ranch, a storm gathered itself into an argument and decided to lose. They arrived dry and exasperated, which is often how people arrive at the end of a day. That night, the porch held them again. Tomas had gone to see a cousin with a stubborn mare. Mercer slept the sleep of a calf, who has concluded he invented hay. Jesse set the iron skillet on the rail between them and placed the two letters, Headmaster and Lydia, beside it, like a case before a judge. "Choose," he said, "not for fire, for keeping." Nora touched the neat cruelty of the headmaster's hand. She did not feel brave. She felt tired of paying rent to men who no longer lived in her head. "Keep the one from the girl," she said. "I'll remember the other without its paper." She folded Lydia's letter and tucked it in the blue jar that held the sugar, because sweetness deserves guardians. They spoke then, but not to explain. He told her his father had once strung a length of fence wire tight and plucked it with a bone pick to make a note that sounded like a train arriving through grief. He said music is just tension given a reason, Jesse murmured. "I didn't understand then. I do now." "Grammar is the same," Nora said. "Rules are wires. Meaning is what hums when you pull them right." A coyote sang to the east, and another answered with an opinion. The night resumed. The week of the site observation. The ranch became a classroom where the lesson was composure. Jesse walked the ditch at dawn, a big man practicing small steps. Tomas set tools out in the order he would need them, but worked slower than usual, which is how calm can be performed until it becomes true. Nora mended, baked, and made the rooms hold their breath in that tidy way houses have when they want to be judged kindly. Pike arrived with the surveyor and the lawyer, and one extra man whose job was to carry the measuring chain and look skeptical. Banks trailed them not because he loved water law, but because he despised men making trouble without witnesses. They followed Jesse to the bend at the cottonwoods. The creek did its quiet work, unconcerned with committee. Leaves shook their silver and returned to green as if to demonstrate truth is a reversible fabric. Carter, the surveyor, set his tripod with ceremony. He peered, scribbled, peered again. The lawyer tried to look comfortable in dust and failed at it with distinction. Pike folded his hands as if in prayer to arithmetic. Tomas waited until Carter had finished his first set of figures. Then he stepped to the bank and knelt, one hand on the soil. "Here," he said. "Smell." He crumbled a pinch and held it to the surveyor. Carter hesitated, then obeyed. The smell was damp and ancient, a recipe older than offices. "Old channel," Tomas said. "It fed this side when my mother was young and the one before her. Your line is new, the ground is faithful." Jesse kept his face without expression. Nora felt something inside her stand a little straighter, the way a girl stands when the teacher calls her by her proper name. Carter cleared his throat. "The elevations are not wrong," Tomas finished, kind as a man correcting a child. "They are incomplete." Banks chuckled into his sleeve. Pike shot him a look that would have fined him if looks had jurisdiction. Nora stood back and let the show be the show. She focused instead on the simple if of the calf she had saved and the simpler yes of the melon sprout. She thought of the girl Lydia, of Mrs. Boyd's tired voice, of all the women who learned to take their shame to market and trade it for flour. She thought of her father's violin, the one that had sung in rooms too small for its sound. The men finally packed their instruments, which is the word they used for things that made other people's lives change shape. Pike thanked Jesse without affection. "We'll notify you of our decision," he said, "which is administrative for surprise." "You'll notify the land," Jesse said. "It will let us know if you were right." When they had gone, the ranch exhaled. Tomas slapped the dust from his trousers and kissed the cottonwood's bark. "Gracias," he said, to the tree or the day or both. On the porch that evening, Nora took the iron skillet and fried thin slices of potato in bacon fat until the kitchen remembered joy. She plated them on a chipped dish and carried it to the steps where Jesse Saturday they ate with their fingers, greedy and civilized in turn. Grease shone on his thumb. She handed him a rag without looking like a woman who had always known his hands. He took it without looking like a man who felt entitled to the gesture. "You were brave," he said finally. "I was angry carefully," she corrected. "It's different." He nodded. "I prefer it." She reached into her pocket and brought out the blue ribbon she'd used to tie back the curtain days ago. Without asking why she was doing it, she wrapped it around the porch rail and knotted it fast. A small flag, not for wars but for staying. "What's that for?" he asked. "To mark the place where we told the truth and didn't drown," she said. He considered that and left the ribbon in peace. A letter came from Street Lewis 2 days later, the kind with edges that cut before they were opened. Her aunt wrote that the collector had agreed to consider alternate arrangements, which means he had found a better victim or a conscience in his desk. She had added, in a postscript smaller than hope, "A lawyer's wife has taken up your cause quietly. She says a certain headmaster's son has left town with a chorus girl and unpaid bills. Reputations travel faster than trains." Nora read the lines twice, then laid the paper on the table and turned the lamp up a notch, as if light could make news more true. "I will not let this make me forgiving," she said aloud. "You don't have to forgive to put a stone down," Jesse said from the doorway. "You just have to decide not to carry it where it isn't needed." She folded the letter. Not like a weapon, but like a blanket. They did not celebrate. They stacked wood. They fed Mercer. They checked the ditch, which did not care about gossip. When they finally sat, the night put its hand on their shoulders like an old friend who has learned not to talk too much. "Tell me something good," Nora said, the way children ask for stories. Jesse thought about it. "Once," he said slowly, "on a winter drive, we camped in cottonwoods that had held leaves past their time. We built a fire in the lee of a trunk, as wide as my regret. In the middle of the night the wind changed, and the tree shed all at once. We woke to a storm of leaves falling without anger. It sounded like paper forgiving itself for being cut. Nora smiled into the dark. That's good. He looked toward the room where Lydia's letter slept beside the sugar. Tell me something true, he asked in return. She obliged him. I think sometimes I am more afraid of happiness than of loss, she said. Loss I know how to endure. Happiness asks me to trust a future that isn't obligated to keep its word. That's why we build fences, he said. Not to keep everything out. To give the right things a chance to stay. She leaned her head against the porch post, and the wood did not mind. The stars insisted on their particularities. Somewhere, a train did what trains do left, arrived, repeated the moral that everything moving is not necessarily lost. They did not kiss. They did not promise. They let the quiet dog of truth sleep across the doorway and guard what it had learned. Silver Day arrived with bunting that tried too hard and pies that didn't need to. The band found the 4 chords it loved and stuck to them with admirable fidelity. Children ran in slow loops through the dust, faces sugared, hair already losing arguments with wind. The sheriff's dog wore a red ribbon and bore it like a medal. Even the sky seemed rehearsed, a blue too clear to be sincere. Nora wore a calico she'd bargained off Mrs. Hammond for less than a greedy mood. Jesse had shaved and failed to look harmless. Tomas came late, smelling of saddle soap and respectability, his hat tilted at a degree suggesting he'd seen too much celebration to take it personally. The town's annual Silver Day Festival was meant to commemorate the founding of Silver Butte, though no one could quite remember who had founded it or why. But every year it came around, and people made peace with their differences for the price of a raffle ticket and a slice of pie. They danced badly, which is the right way, and laughed in the polite places, which is unavoidable. Jesse, who'd always looked more natural beside a horse than on a dance floor, moved with the careful deliberation of a man afraid of stepping on history. Nora followed his lead because he never pushed her into it. He simply made space for her to find the rhythm on her own. Your steps are getting surer, he murmured as they circled the plank floor. It's easier to trust the ground when it doesn't talk back, she said. That's why I don't go to church, he replied. They both laughed a low, private laugh that smelled faintly of lemonade and dust. The heat was mercifully dry, the kind that pressed rather than smothered. Over by the flagpole, Pike and his associates stood like surveyor's stakes, marking territory that didn't belong to them. Sheriff Banks kept a loose eye on everyone, one hand near his belt, not out of fear but habit. At the far end of the square, Mercer the calf, now more bull-headed than calfish, was tied to a post near Tomas's wagon. The old man had insisted on bringing him, for luck, he'd said, though the animal's loud opinion on every subject suggested otherwise. Children took turns feeding him handfuls of grass, while their mothers whispered about Nora in that way women whisper when they both judge and envy the same person. Jesse led her to the lemonade table, where the ice floated like small survivors of a sinking ship. For a suspended instant, the noise around them became the kind you hear in your own blood when you are about to decide something you can't undecide. Not for appearances, he said, looking at her as at a horizon he meant to ride anyway. Nora, I'd like you to stay because you want to, not because the town mistook us and we let it. I have 2 rooms and a piece of ground that makes sense to my hands. I have a name that doesn't scare children. I don't have much else, but what I have is yours if you say so. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the sound of her own heart clicking like a distant telegraph. She opened her mouth, but the past had made it on time and wanted a word. Oliver Finch materialized with a smile that had never met a mirror. It didn't flatter. Edwin Pike trailed him, all ink and edge, like a shadow that charged rent. There she is, Finch announced, as if unveiling a painting he'd decided wasn't to his taste. Miss Hart of the extensive opinions. Calder, you may return damaged goods. I have a train receipt. The nearby laughter stopped being free and became rented. Mrs. Hammond froze mid-pour. The band faltered, confused about whether drama required music. Even the wind seemed to lean closer, curious which way decency would break. Jesse did not step in front of her. He stepped beside her. "Mr. Finch," he said, "you are standing between a woman and her dignity. You should move for your own safety." Finch snorted. "Safety? Will you shoot me with public sentiment?" "No," Jesse said, with silence. "It travels farther." "Oh." Nora faced the man who had made her begin again at the wrong end of the world. "Oliver," she said, using his first name as if returning him to a smaller room. "You paid for a ticket and wrote a letter. That's all you ever truly did. I will not be cheapened by your thrift." Finch's smile curdled. "You always did think too much of yourself. Some men find that trait less than pleasing." "I wasn't applying," she said. Pike glanced at the sheriff, already calculating how this would become useful. "We're all very moved," he said. "Now, Mr. Calder, about the matter of water." "Water belongs to the land before it belongs to books," Jesse said mildly. "My ditch keeps a garden alive and a herd honest. Your survey keeps your office cool. I will not trade one for the other." Finch tried strategy. "You think yourself a hero because you took in a fallen—" "Careful," the sheriff said, not loud but final. The word dropped into the dust like a coin that no one dared to pick up. Nora felt the weight lift, not because a man had made a threat, but because another had named the boundary. She reached for Jesse's hand in the way you reach for the banister, when the stairs are still there in the dark, even if you can't see them. "Yes," she said. The word surprised even her with its shape. It fit her teeth like it had been waiting there, rehearsing its escape. She turned to Jesse, ignoring the crowd that stood on its tiptoes to drink her future. "Yes," she repeated, her voice steady now. "To the question you asked, not to defeat a man who never deserved the chance to ruin me, and not to quiet gossip that doesn't buy flour. Yes, because this life suits my soul and your kindness suits my days." Something bright and undressed crossed Jesse's face. It looked like relief put to music. He squeezed her hand once, as if to acknowledge the weight of a vow that would prefer action to ceremony. Around them, the band found a waltz. Tomas grinned and vanished on official business that smelled like organizing a preacher. Pike leaned in. "Last try. A wife won't stop the committee," he said. "Sell the rights. Build a bigger porch with the money. Consider the child you'll have someday, and the water she'll need. This—" Jesse looked at him as you look at a rattlesnake when it's not quite close enough to waste a bullet on. "I am considering the child," he said. "That's why the water will stay where it does the most good. And the men who try to move it will learn the difference between can and should." They danced. Poorly again. The town, which had come for sandwiches and sanctimony, discovered itself rooting for a future it could gossip about for free. The hat was passed. Someone pledged seed. Mrs. Hammond found a bolt of blue Nora would try not to love too much. At dusk on the edge of the cottonwoods, Jesse said it plain under a sky that had quit its theatrics and gone tender. "Nora Hart, will you marry me as yourself, not as my solution?" "I will," she said, and the words fit in her mouth like they'd been carved for her. The crowd exhaled as if a sermon had ended. The band struck up something jubilant to fill the space between relief and curiosity. Sheriff Banks shook Jesse's hand with a grin that said, "Well, you just made half the county believe in something again." Tomas returned with a preacher in tow thin as a fence post, sweating righteousness. "The Lord does not require paperwork," he declared, "but the territory does." "Then we'll honor both," Jesse said. The vows were short, the kind that could fit in a saddlebag. Tomas handed over 2 rings hammered from silver quarters. Nora's was slightly misshapen. Jesse's was smooth from years of being something else. "Do you have any words for the bride?" the preacher asked. "I do," Jesse said. He looked at her, and the whole town forgot to breathe. "You came here with nothing owed. Stay that way." Nora's throat tightened. "And you," she said softly, "have lived like a man apologizing for the weather. Stop that." The preacher blinked. "Good enough," he said, and pronounced them married. Applause rippled across the square, uneven but genuine. Mrs. Hammond cried openly, which she claimed later was from the dust. Someone fired a pistol into the air, because celebration is easier when it echoes. Jesse kissed her not long, not showy, just enough to prove the moment had happened. He smelled of cedar, sweat, and something like trust. Later, when the stars began to bother the darkness, the crowd thinned. Finch was gone. Pike lingered like smoke that didn't know how to leave, and the band packed its courage into cases. Nora sat on the edge of the wagon, her new ring catching lamplight. "Do you regret it already?" Jesse asked. She smiled. "Only that I didn't do it before you asked." Tomas returned from somewhere mysterious, with a grin as wide as the ditch. "I tell the preacher to write it proper," he said. "Senora Calder. It has a good sound, eh?" "Feels heavier than it looks," Nora said. "Good names should," Tomas replied. The next morning, Silver Butte wore its hangover like a badge. Stray bunting clung to fences, and the air smelled of trampled pie and decisions. Jesse hitched the wagon early. There was work to do no matter what had changed. Nora stood on the porch, still half in disbelief that the house had gone from borrowed to belonging overnight. She touched the rail where the blue ribbon fluttered her old flag of defiance. The knot had held. When Jesse saw her watching the horizon, he stopped beside her. "You're quiet," he said. "I keep thinking of how easy it is to lose everything," she answered. "And how rare it is to choose something worth keeping." He nodded. "The rare things make the noise in a man's head go quiet." By noon, word of their marriage had reached every porch, store counter, and backroom poker table in town. Mrs. Hammond claimed to have caught the bouquet, though there had been none. The postmaster's wife announced that it was about time decency won one. Pike, meanwhile, sat in his office, drafting a letter that began, "In light of recent developments." That afternoon, Sheriff Banks rode out to Half Moon Sea. He found Jesse mending a gate and Nora sketching plans for a garden in a notebook salvaged from the schoolhouse. "Congratulations," Banks said, dismounting. "Whole town's buzzing like a beehive with gossip and goodwill. Can't tell which stings more." Nora smiled. "As long as they spell my name right, I don't mind." The sheriff tipped his hat. "That Pike fellow will come buzzing again, too. Don't let him sting you into something you'll regret." Jesse leaned on the gate. "I plan to keep my water where it belongs." "Good. Water and justice, two things men always claim to own and never really do." The sheriff turned his horse toward town, then paused. "By the way," he said over his shoulder, "your calf wandered into Mrs. Boyd's yard this morning, ate her laundry. She says he's forgiven, but her husband's not." Tomas chuckled from behind the barn. "Mercer has taste, Senor Sheriff." Banks shook his head. "May you two have fewer troubles than your livestock." The week that followed was quiet, deceptively so. Pike kept to town, but his silence had the shape of plotting. The new couple settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and inevitable. Jesse still rose before dawn, still made coffee that could dissolve nails. Nora found herself humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since Street Lewis. She expanded the garden, convinced the soil with her stubbornness, and found beauty in its small concessions. One evening, as they repaired a section of the fence together, Jesse said, "When I was younger, I thought peace would feel like rest. Turns out, it feels like work you don't mind repeating." "Maybe peace is just work with someone you trust," she said. He smiled at that, faint and sincere. They ate supper on the porch, while the sky bruised itself purple. Tomas read aloud from the newspaper, skipping the parts about politics and railroads, keeping only the oddities. A preacher who had baptized a mule, a Kansas farmer who'd taught his chickens to sleep in order. When darkness came, Nora leaned against Jesse's shoulder. The ring on her finger caught moonlight and winked like it knew secrets. "Do you think they'll ever stop talking?" she asked. "About us?" He thought about it. "Maybe when Pike finds a new argument or Finch finds a conscience. So no," she laughed. "Then let them talk. But peace is a thing that has to be earned daily." 2 weeks after Silver Day, a messenger from the county rode out with a folded paper stamped with the committee's seal. Jesse read it once, then again, slower. The survey had ruled water rights east of the Cottonwoods to be held in abeyance, pending further review. Nora frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Jesse said, "they couldn't win honest, so they'll wait for us to fail." Tomas spat in the dust. "They wait long time. We have patience and shovel." They went back to work, because that's what decency does when law drags its feet. Nora wrote to her aunt again, this time describing not despair, but the stubborn miracle of endurance. "The land listens," she wrote, "even when men pretend not to." That night, She found Jesse out by the ditch, watching the stars fall apart and reform. "You'll lose sleep over this," she said. "I lose sleep over many things," he replied. "This one feels worth it." She stood beside him. "Then let's lose it together." He looked at her and smiled, the smile that lives only between people who've chosen each other after seeing the worst. "That's a fair trade," he said. They went inside, where the lamplight flickered over walls that smelled of coffee, hope, and something like home. Outside, the cottonwoods whispered their silver secrets to the night, and the creek kept running steady, loyal, unbothered by men with pens. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. They married under cottonwood shade that traded its silver for green when the wind turned it. Sheriff Banks said the words, because the preacher had been persuaded by distance and whiskey to be late, and law does fine in a pinch when love already knows its part. Tomas stood with a flower in his hat as if the notion amused him deeply. Nora wore blue that made the sky try harder. Jesse wore the same suit he'd worn to his better and worse days. It fit him like the truth honest, a little worn at the seams, serviceable for both sorrow and celebration. There was no grand procession, just the hush that happens when a community witnesses something it didn't have to pay for. The ring Jessie slid onto her finger had once been a quarter. Tomas had hammered it flat on a fence post and polished it with lard and patience. It left a faint scent of iron and dawn on Nora's skin, as if the morning itself had signed the license. "Do you have any words for the groom?" Banks asked, formal for form's sake. Nora lifted her chin. "Yes. Hire my stubbornness when your courage tires. I take wages in coffee and quiet." A ripple of laughter. The sheriff nodded, pleased by the economy of it. "And you, Jesse? I'll try not to talk when the truth can carry itself," he said. "And when your hands are full, I'll be the hook on the wall." "Good enough," Banks said, and the cottonwoods applauded in their way. They ate wedding pie off tin plates and drank lemonade that forgot it was mostly water. Tomas tried to teach Mercer to bow. Mercer tried to eat the flower from his hat and succeeded. The preacher arrived late, red-eared and contrite, insisting on reading a verse to retroactively sanctify what had been done without him. He chose one about rivers and found himself forgiven by proximity to the creek. That night, when the lantern went out and the roof made its old noises, Nora lay with her ear on the geography of Jesse's chest and counted the beats like fence posts. Sleep came on moccasin feet, respectful of newlyweds. The weeks after did what weeks do when two people have work and each other. They hurried and lingered all at once. The ditch bit into earth and found a friend in a siphon that Tomas swore at in 2 languages until it consented to behave. Mercer grew bold and discovered gates. The garden made promises and then, to everyone's astonishment, kept them. In town, Pike filed papers that made lines where water had never agreed to go. The sheriff shrugged with out-loud exasperation and in quiet patience. Courts wrote dates down where rain might laugh at them. They learned the married person's arithmetic of chores, 2 sets of hands that didn't divide the work so much as multiply its meaning. Nora's mending looked less like rescue and more like strategy. Jesse's fence posts went in straighter when she was near to pass the wire and the time. Supper became a conversation between what they could afford and what the day chose to give beans. Yes, and once a rabbit that had mistaken the garden for diplomacy. Cornbread from the tamed left side of the stove. Coffee that was less a drink than a decision renewed. Neighbors came by with gifts that cost money to people who had little. A crock with a hairline crack, a biscuit cutter, a pair of candlesticks lacking candles. Mrs. Boyd brought sheet music and a smile that remembered its job. "Play it on the table," she said to Nora. "It'll make a sound anyway." Nora did, tapping rhythm with the spoon against the wood, humming the shape of notes she'd once taught to girls who believed music lived mostly in pianos. Jesse listened with the grave attention he gave to storms. One morning, clouds walked in from the west in their shirt sleeves and sat down. Rain fell, the windmill turned without complaint. The ground smelled like a hymn you remember from a childhood you weren't certain you'd had. Nora stood in it, hair unpinned, and Jesse watched from the porch, not because he owned the site but because he'd been invited. He kept his hands in his pockets to keep from clapping at the weather, which would have been silly and therefore tempting. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of the last West town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Silver Butte did not transform into a kinder place. It became exactly itself, which is harder and better. Some men learned how not to speak about Nora. Some learned to speak carefully. A few could not learn and found themselves talking only to one another. Pike's committee posted a notice that would have made a poorer man sell. Jesse tacked it to the barn and went back to work. Water is a long game. Men with pens move on to other alphabets. They took a photograph at the end of summer. Nora seated with a book she wasn't reading. Jesse standing with a hand on the chair, not to claim, but to steady. Behind them, the ditch glittered in a crooked line, honest as a scar that healed right. Tomás insisted on the second plate, por si acaso, and the photographer obliged with a sigh and an extra nickel's worth of art. When the image dried, the four of them, Nora, Jesse, Tomás, and a blurred Mercer wandering in at the frame's edge, looked like a story that had chosen to be ordinary and thereby become rare. Nora learned 1,000 new ways to be useful. She planted beans beside corn so the vines could climb ambition without apology. She stitched pockets inside Jesse's work shirts, where a man might keep a pencil for numbers or a stick of peppermint for courage. She traded a hem for a sack of flour, a lesson in reading for a bar of soap that pretended to be civilized. In the evenings, she wrote to her aunt about irrigating stubborn ground and letting people change at their own speed. She never wrote about waking in the night and pressing her fingers to the inside of her wrist, counting hope, that she kept for the Cottonwoods, who had time for such confessions. Jesse, for his part, discovered that the house liked being looked after. Hinges quit complaining when he noticed their feelings. The pump gave up its grudge when he replaced a washer. Tomás swore had been a washer when Lincoln was a boy. He whittled small animals for Mercer to ignore, and a spoon for Nora that fit her hand like a well-tailored sentence. Once, near dusk, a group of boys from town came racing their ponies along the fence line, whooping in that way boys do when they're trying on large versions of themselves. One peeled off and rode too close to the ditch, where the sandy edge was a liar. His mount lurched. He slid, arms pinwheeling, into the water and stood sputtering, pride drowned ankle deep. Nora was there first with a towel. Jesse second with a steadying hand and no commentary. The boy's name was Eli. His father was a man who thought a belt was the only sermon boys heard. When Eli returned the towel the next day, he did it with fists clenched in case gratitude required a fight. Nora took it with both hands the way you take back a small miracle and smiled like she wouldn't tell. The sheriff's visits became less official and more human. Banks would lean on the porch post and talk about the kind of law that lives in a town's common sense rather than in a book. The trick is to make sure the book and the sense are at least on speaking terms, he'd say, sipping coffee that could file a badge smooth. He kept them apprised of Pike's maneuvers without making a theater of it. They'll come for a look at the East Ridge, he warned. Wear your good manners and your worst patience. On a morning that tasted like apples you couldn't afford yet, Jesse saddled the dun mare and led her to the porch. There's a spring beyond the East Ridge, he said. Tomás saw a willow where there shouldn't be. If we can bring it down in a pipe, then the melons will move from rumor to fact, Nora said, eyes bright. She tied her hat under her chin and stepped into the stirrup like a woman who had learned both her balance and her worth. They rode out while the sun was still deciding whether to be kind. The ride was the kind that makes a person inventory her blessings and griefs against the shape of the land. Sage gave way to rock, rock to red clay to a seam of green that couldn't keep its secret. At the ridge, they dismounted and listened. The land does speak if you agree to hush. In the draw below, water stitched through stone a thin seam, stubborn, more yes than maybe. Jesse grinned in the way a man does, who has backed the right kind of foolish. We can make this sing, he said. It'll cost sweat and pipe and Tomás's temper, but we can. Nora crouched and dipped her fingers, then touched them to her lips, as if swearing something to someone who'd never break a promise. "Then we will," she said. She stood and looked east, where the world made a case for itself in changing light. A hawk wrote its name across the sky and erased it again. Sometimes the future behaves like that, visible and undeciphered at once. On the way back, they stopped at a lone juniper that had learned the art of difficult survival. Jesse opened his canteen and poured a capful at the roots. "For the work you've done," he said to the tree, who accepted the tribute without boasting. Nora smiled at the ritual. She liked a man who remembered to thank what had stood still for him. They returned to find Tomas already measuring in steps that had nothing to do with feet and everything to do with old country wisdom. "We make the pipe think it is lazy," he said, as if describing a mule. "Then it will work hard to prove us wrong." "Oh." Nora sketched the plan on a scrap of brown paper. Source to bend, bend to ditch, ditch to garden, garden to table, table to laughter, laughter to the part of a person that isn't hungry anymore. She pinned it to the wall by the door, where other maps had already failed to direct her life, and let this one try. Pike's notice arrived like a fly in cream, small, noisy, contaminating. Site inspection scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m., it read, and carried the polite threat of men who believe appointments are power. Jesse cleaned the porch anyway. Tomas shined the pump handle with bacon grease until it looked like the idea of water. Nora baked a pie she had no intention of sharing. The men arrived with tidy hats and untidy intentions. They measured and noted and declared the word abeyance again, which is bureaucracy for "if we can't win today, we'll win tomorrow by waiting you into poverty." Jesse answered each question with the patience of a man who had thought the answers through at dawn. Nora smiled as one smiles at a mosquito civil, non-negotiable. Banks shadowed the proceedings with a face like a closed book that had sometimes been a good read. When the inspectors left, the ranch exhaled. The pie cooled, unoffered, and then was eaten by those who had earned it. "They will come again," Tomas said, finger-tapping the table to the rhythm of inevitability. "We will have more pie then, too." They took a photograph again, this time at the end of summer. Nora seated with a book she wasn't reading. Jesse standing with a hand on the chair, not to claim but to steady. Behind them, the ditch glittered in a crooked line, honest as a scar that healed right. Tomas insisted on the second plate, "Porci acaso," and the photographer obliged with a sigh and an extra nickel's worth of art. Mercy looked back at them from paper that would go brown around the edges and still hold a shape. Autumn arrived as a rumor of cool, and then as fact. The melons put on weight, and then humility. Nora tested one with a knock and listened, head cocked. "It's like hearing if a story is done," she explained to Jesse. "If the sound comes back hollow and pleased, you cut." They cut. The inside was sunrise. Jesse smiled as if the fruit had accepted his apology for once, thinking this land wasn't generous. Letters crossed the desert, one from Nora's aunt with the news that the collector had been embarrassed into empathy, one from Lydia, the schoolgirl grown braver, telling of a job in a library and a room with light in the right places. "You told me grammar was a ladder," Lydia wrote. "I found the roof." Nora read the letter twice and kept it between the pages of a seed catalog, where hope tends to nap. When the first frost laced the porch steps, Jesse built a small lean-to for wood and another for tenderness. He would not have called it that, but that's what it was, a place to store the thing that kept them warm. Nora stitched a quilt from scraps of shirts that had lived lives and insisted on one more. She pieced together Missouri stripes, Street Louis checks, half-moon sea plaids. In the center she set a square of blue calico that the sky still envied. They slept under it like two promises, keeping each other. Tomas found a stray pup with a tail that wagged in the wrong direction before its body remembered how to follow. "We don't need a dog," Jesse said, and then fed it bacon. The pup was named Dulce because he wasn't. Mercer loathed him on principle. The two came to an arrangement brokers would admire. On a day with wind like a clean sheet, Nora paused mid-chore and leaned against the doorframe. She pressed a palm to her belly, not because there was a secret yet, but because one felt invited. She stood there until Jesse came in and, reading her face, set down his hat without comment. They shared a silence that didn't ask for proof. "Do you ever wonder," she said at last, "what we would have done if we hadn't found each other at the station?" "Eaten worse," he said, "slept less, worked the same." He stepped behind her and wrapped his arms under hers, hands crossing at her waist like two signatures finally on the same line. "I might have solved the ditch. I don't think I would have learned quiet." "Quiet?" she said, amused. "You're the quietest man I know." "There's quiet that is hiding," he said, "and quiet that is listening. One is an absence, the other is a presence. You taught me the second." Winter elbowed its way in, as winter does. The stove learned who was boss. The cottonwoods let go their leaves in a single afternoon, and the ranch wore its bones without shame. Banks dropped by before a storm with a sack of coffee from a contraband source, and news from Pike the committee would delay until spring. "Progress must wait on mud," he said, hat dripping, grin dry. They waited too, but not like people in line. They waited like farmers by doing other necessary things, while the big thing decided whether to happen. Nora read out loud in the evenings, making sentences pull their weight. Jessie whittled a little horse for the mantle that refused to stand on all four legs, and therefore was perfect. Tomas told stories of a boy who once thought the horizon was a straight line until he rode far enough to learn it was a circle. Dulce learned to sit. Mercer did not. In late winter they took the long ride out to the East Ridge again, not to measure but to remember. Snow lay in the shadows like someone's careful mistake. The spring stitched through stone as it had in summer, a silver thread that did not know what month it was supposed to be. Nora crouched and drank from her hands, face bare to the cold. "I like water best when it forgets itself," she said. "Same," Jessie answered, and they stood a while saying nothing important with great conviction. Back on the horses, they looked toward Half Moon Sea. It sat where it always had, a small, right answer in a long, difficult equation. The future didn't wave. It didn't need to. It waited, wide as the basin and just as patient. They turned the mares toward home, riding in a companionable silence that governments cannot regulate. The trail bent, and with it, their lives not abruptly, not in cliffhanger fashion, but with the steady grace of a path that knows where it's going long before the rider does. There would be papers in town, and courtrooms, and talk. There would also be melons, and winter, and a child, maybe, one day, whose first word might be water or yes. When the house came into view, smoke drawing a line honest as breath, Nora touched Jessie's sleeve. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "What?" "The sound of something beginning again," she said, "like hinges after oil." He listened, and because he loved her, he heard it too. The horizon didn't close, it opened, the way a door opens when you remember to push instead of pull. Their figures thinned against the light like two brushstrokes. The painter chose not to finish invitation rather than period. The story's breath held, the next chapter already turning somewhere just out of frame.